The first thing I want people to know is when you sleep, your brain is not resting. And I love the fact that we don't ask to sleep. We don't have to activate dreaming, that it is stimulus independent. We don't nudge it. Dreams erupt. They almost have to be released.
Oi, oi! Hoje aqui no estúdio da TV Estadão a gente recebe o Dr. Jandial, que é neurocirurgião, neurocientista e autor do livro Por que Sonhamos. Welcome, doctor. How are you?
I'm great. Pleasure to be here.
So, let's start. The first question is...
Pergunto para ele, em inglês, por que os sonhos fascinam tanto ele? Houve algum caso ou algum fato que despertou esse interesse?
In your interest.
That's a great question to start with. As a brain surgeon, we do this exotic surgery called awake brain surgery. The patient is awake and we're operating on their brain and they're talking to us. Part of that is mapping the brain, where we tickle the brain with a surface electrode, a tiny bit of electricity, to map language on the surface of the brain. And I remember 20-something years ago when I was in training, and since the 1950s it's been reported that while mapping the surface of the brain, patients, including mine, will report, oh, that was a nightmare. Since I've been having that nightmare since I was a kid, and then we'll take the electrode off. That's possible because the brain doesn't feel directly, it feels through the nerves in our body. What I remember was, this is powerful, because for thousands of years we thought, where do dreams come from? We thought the brain is inactive, so they must come from the heavens and gods. But to look at the brain, to stimulate the brain and have that patient and person experience a nightmare proves something very fundamental, that dreams come from our brains and not outside our skulls. That's powerful because for thousands of years we had no idea. So I love, that was my entrance into why do we dream? What is a dream? But that's the powerful example I started with.
Algo que você escreveu me chamou muita atenção. Você está mais vivo quando sonha do que quando acordado. Poderia me explicar melhor por quê?
Well, that's a big statement, and more alive, at least in the sense of emotion. So let's unpack that a little bit.
Please.
The first thing I want people to know is when you sleep, your brain is not resting. That's not an opinion, that's a measurement. We can put electrodes on the surface of your scalp and measure the electricity. The electricity generated while we're awake and talking and while we're asleep and dreaming is equally robust. Your dreaming brain and your waking brain are slightly different. Different continents and swaths are activated and dampened. So overall, the measurement is equal, but in your dreaming brain, the executive network, the part that does reason and logic, is slightly dampened. And in its place, emotion is liberated, imagination is liberated. So when you start to think about dreams as a result of a dreaming brain state at the level of the flesh and electricity, I love the fact that your emotional centers can reach a top speed. We were talking earlier about Formula One. So they can reach a top speed that your waking brain can't. So in that way, whether erotic dreams or emotions or jealousy, they are potentially stronger in our dream life than they are our waking life. I love those kind of big concepts backed up with science.
Perfect. And you argue that dreams are...
Você argumenta que os sonhos são um aspecto evolutivo. Escreveu que não decidimos sonhar, precisamos sonhar. Qual a vantagem evolutiva de sonhar para a nossa espécie?
For our species.
So I'll give you the science, then I'll give you the opinion. I like to separate those two, so when people listen to this, they walk away and they say, okay, the brain is not resting while we sleep. And that's a measurement. That's not my opinion. The electricity proves it. The little heat map of how much glucose is being used proves it. Then the question becomes, well, what's going on and why? Well, we know what's going on. Imagination and emotion is liberated and logic is dampened. Then the question becomes, why? And there I have some opinions. Why? Some have said it's a threat rehearsal. If you're running from a woolly mammoth, you're better at it the next day. I don't discount that. Some have said it's a nocturnal therapist. It helps us deal with our emotions and memories. Sometimes, but sometimes dreams torture us too. So I like to back out of that and not ask us to put dreaming into a box we wouldn't waking life. We have emotions during the day we don't hold on to. We have thoughts that are useless. I think the dreaming brain similarly is a large process. I believe, so this is my opinion, that because it's expensive, it uses a lot of glucose, because it puts us in danger, it's not around as an accident, right? Evolution's not gonna hold on to something dangerous and expensive and just say it's along for the ride like an appendix, right? It's not passive. And when you look at the brain state, hyper-emotional, hyper-imaginative, I believe that's why we dream, to liberate emotions and creativity that we wouldn't during the normal part of our day. London to Uber in Sao Paulo, that constrains our mind. We don't use the edges, we don't use the corners of our thought and even neurons. And if you remember with the brain, it's use it or lose it. I think dreaming is this nightly process that uses all the corners of our mind so it's available to us the next day. I love that sort of larger concept.
Você chegou a escrever que os pesadelos podem ser até mais importantes do que sonhos bons. Por quê?
So when I was asked to write this book by the publishers in London, I wanted to make sure it was accessible to everybody, right? Not just this thing in academic. I mean, there is no professor of dream science, so I had to pull from a lot of different things. But when I talked to people in Los Angeles, I'd go to the game or I'd go to the bar, and the first thing they would say is, come on, nightmares can't be good for us, all right? I mean, they torture us, they wake us up. By definition, a nightmare not only is extremely disturbing, but it wakes you up. It has to wake you up to be a nightmare, otherwise it's a bad dream. And unlike the dream recall we were talking about earlier, that can be, fleeting for many, by definition, a nightmare wakes you up and then it makes you remember everything you dreamed. That's a definition of nightmare. They come in two patterns when I look at it. They look at, I'm talking about the science, but the last 40, 60 years, people have been giving surveys of what they're dreaming about. They've asked kids, families have signed kids up from age like 2 to 20 and asked them and woke them up through their longitudinally. And you can see when the nightmares arrive, when erotic dreams arrive. I mean, it's a very interesting thing. I look at those surveys. Earlier we talked about measurements, electricity, surveys and questionnaires, and I found some interesting patterns. Nightmares arrive for children no matter their lifestyle, no matter their life experiences, traumatized life, refugee camps, children who have never had any stress. It seems to be a cognitive development, like age 4, 5, 6, nightmares arrive for all of us, and they arrive in children. And then when the children say that I was dreaming of some animals, it's never their pet, or rarely their pet. It's beasts. So when I see that, it feels like it's a cognitive development. Like my 3 sons, when they learned to walk and talk, their mind was learning to develop also, right? We're not born finalized. Then erotic dreams arrive, and people say, what do you mean by cognitive development? So look at adolescence. The brain is the same, but the person completely changes. And so I think nightmares arrive at a time when there's another development going on. It's called theory of mind, the sense that, what is the other person thinking? That person might be smiling, but they mean me harm. That capacity develops in our children's minds, and it happens at the same time as nightmares arrive. So my opinion, based on those surveys and patterns, is nightmares are shaping a sense of self versus other, and that this is a cognitive development that is a part of our growth. I may not have the best opinion or the final opinion, of course not, but they're not accidental, and I think they cultivate the mind. So that's why the chapter 2 was bold. Nightmares are needed.
Perfect.
Sobre a relação entre sonhos e saúde física e mental, o que já temos de evidência científica suficientes para considerar essas viagens oníricas como um sinal de alerta?
As a warning sign.
Well, let's take one that we all know about, flashbacks with PTSD. So that's a memory on loop of something bad that happened. Whereas in children, I think nightmares cultivate the mind. They rarely get something called nightmare disorder. It doesn't ruin the next day. In adults, 4% of people have nightmare disorder. Their brain conjures up a nightmare, and then the next day is ruined. Interestingly, the treatment for that is something called imagery rehearsal therapy, where you re-script the direction of your nightmare with a therapist and you practice it. And just like your imagination conjured a nightmare, your intention can redirect the ending of a nightmare. That's beautiful, right?
Oh my God.
Imagery rehearsal therapy for nightmares. Then taking it further, since your hyper-emotional, imaginative brain is releasing these dreams, and some of them we remember, I think they can be a portal to your mental health. One specific example, it's inexact, it's not always true, it's not for everyone, but I just want to open people's mind to that potential. One example would be nightmares, new onset and progressive. You have an occasional nightmare, it's all good, you know, it doesn't ruin the next day, you're coping with it. But if they show up more and more frequently and get stronger and stronger, that is linked, doesn't cause, but to depression and suicidal ideation. Interestingly, that pattern of nightmares can happen when your daytime is relatively stress-free, or you think it's stress-free. You think you're coping well with the stresses of the day, but you start to have these new crop of nightmares. That's worth talking to your doctor about. And the way I explain it to people, it's just like headaches. Occasional headache is fine, but new onset, the headache won't go away. It's getting stronger, That's something to talk to your doctor about. So in that one concrete way, the change in dream pattern can give you some insight, I think, about your mental health.
No livro você escreve que o padrão de sonhos, a maneira como se sonha, pode ser importante para homens a partir de 50 anos. Por quê?
Yeah, so it's not a common thing, but to me it's the unicorn. Because right now when there's one unicorn, you're like, okay, unicorns exist. This is something that people can look up. This isn't my opinion, or I'm pulling from a journal article that is, you know, this is an established thing. It's called REM behavior disorder, all caps REM. What I call it is dream enactment disorder, where men in their 50s, they start to act out their dreams, usually assaulting a bed partner. They come in to get evaluated. Those people with that change in dream pattern, invariably 10 to 15 years later will develop Parkinson's. Now let me put that in context.
Please.
The withering brain, the first warning flare it sends out is a change in dreaming pattern 15 years before. And to me, that's exactly what this book is about. Like, there are things I thought that would have no science or would be completely woo-woo, you know, as they say. And I was surprised. No, there's some rigorous science behind lucid dreaming, that the decaying brain, its first warning to the world, to itself, is a change in dream patterns. I'm a brain surgeon saying that.
Você escreveu que os sonhos são uma valiosa ferramenta de autoconhecimento, mas que recorrer a sites ou conhecimentos populares para interpretá-los muito provavelmente não vai surtir efeito algum. Como interpretar sonhos? Cientificamente falando, temos evidências que interpretá-los apresenta algum benefício?
Well, I think it's individual. I'll say briefly, I see 5 clusters of dreams that you can try to interpret. One, you don't need to interpret them. If you're given a presentation, you have a dream by showing up naked. Waking anxiety and dream anxiety, linked. Some, they're junk dreams, just images and thoughts. I mean, we don't always have to assign value to everything. Then there's genre dreams, end-of-life dreams, pregnancy dreams. Your waking life is so intense with one experience, then your dreaming life, they're just completely intertwined. That doesn't need interpretation. Nightmares and erotic dreams, I think they serve a purpose, cultivating the mind, getting us ready for procreation. Then the last category of dream is the one I think that we should go and reflect upon, is the hyper-emotional, hyper-visual dream. Because I think since your brain is in a hyper-emotional, hyper-visual, hyper-imaginative state, the one that has that emotional linger, that residue, could be a portal to your thoughts, could offer you an insight, and just pausing during the day to take a moment to reflect, maybe that's the next step in a life well lived. We spend so much time with wellness and hacks and regimens and pills and eat this and don't eat this. And I hope your listeners see that dreams are not to be dismissed, actually they're to be welcomed, you know? And their meaning is symbolic, it's metaphorical. It's not gonna spell it out for you. But just the process of reflecting upon why you're intensely emotional brain released this and your waking brain held on to it, I think that's an interesting thing to cultivate as our daily habit, particularly sleep entry and sleep exit.
Thank you for being here, doctor.
My pleasure. I love Brazil.